January 1944. The winter sun barely reached over the pine rows of Aliceville, Alabama. Frost clung to the razor wire, and the air smelled faintly of diesel, soap, and boiled cabbage from the mess hall. A new train had arrived that morning from the East Coast, boxcars carrying captured German officers, their faces gray with fatigue and disbelief. They stepped down slowly, boots crunching on the gravel of foreign soil. Inside the camp infirmary, a U.S. Army nurse adjusted her white cap and gloves. Lieutenant Helen Ramsey of the Army Nurse Corps checked the incoming list: ranks, wounds, vitals. When the first officer entered, his field coat still bearing the Africa Corps patch, he stiffened instinctively. He expected hostility, perhaps revenge. Instead, she saluted, not as an ally, but as a professional, and motioned to the cot. "Sit down." "Please," she said evenly. "You're in medical custody now." That single act, routine, procedural, devoid of hate, startled him more than capture itself. And it was happening in camps across America. Because this was how the United States chose to fight a moral war. By 1942, the tide of the Second World War had turned enough for the Allies to face a logistical problem few had anticipated: what to do with tens of thousands of captured Axis soldiers. North Africa was the first great test. The surrender of General Erwin Rommel's Africa Corps at Tunis in May 1943 left Britain with more prisoners than it could house. The Royal Navy convoys crossing the Atlantic began carrying not only food and tanks westward, but men, defeated soldiers shipped to a continent they had once imagined subduing. When the first transport trains pulled into U.S. depots that summer, American towns were stunned by the sight of uniformed Germans stepping down under guard. They came in convoys of boxcars and converted coaches, flanked by military police with carbines at the ready. Over the next 3 years, more than 371,000 Germans would be held on American soil, scattered across roughly 700 prisoner-of-war camps stretching from California deserts to the Carolinas. Alabama alone would host nearly 45,000 men, Texas nearly 80,000. The guiding document for this unprecedented undertaking was the 1929 Geneva Convention on the Treatment of Prisoners of War, which the United States had ratified between wars. Its language was precise. Enemy combatants must receive food, shelter, and medical care equivalent to that provided to U.S. troops. For Washington, adherence was more than legality. It was propaganda of morality. Every well-fed prisoner was a silent rebuke to Nazi claims that democracy was hypocrisy. Thus, the War Department built its camps like small, self-contained towns, rows of tar paper barracks, mess halls, chapels, libraries, recreation fields, and, always, an infirmary. Officers were separated from enlisted men. Those who had been members of the Nazi Party were often kept apart. Work programs sent able-bodied prisoners into fields or sawmills under civilian supervision, their wages deposited in camp canteens to be spent on cigarettes, soap, or stationery. Inside the fences, daily life followed a predictable rhythm. At dawn, the bugle called "roll." At midday, labor detachments marched out under watchtower eyes. Evenings brought chess, choir practice, or the camp orchestra. Discipline was firm, but by design, never cruel. Military police were instructed to maintain order without humiliation. Yet beneath that order ran a quiet current of ideology. These were men who had marched under the swastika, taught to see mercy as weakness. Many officers arrived braced for vindictive treatment, recalling Allied bombings of their cities and expecting retaliation. Instead, they met the efficiency of an American bureaucracy guided by law and the professionalism of military women whose duty knew no hatred. The infirmary was the purest expression of that paradox. Within its walls, the enemy became a patient. Nurses in crisp fatigues logged each arrival, cleaned wounds, administered sulfa powder, and issued vaccinations identical to those given to U.S. soldiers. The Geneva Convention mandated equal medical priority, and the Army Medical Department enforced it with rigorous precision. Records were kept in triplicate. Inspections by neutral Swiss delegates verified compliance. That humanitarian facade, however, demanded immense coordination. Every region required trained personnel to sustain thousands of prisoners. Doctors were scarce, nurses scarcer. The Army Nurse Corps, barely 7,000 strong in 1941, expanded tenfold in 4 years. Its officers were commissioned, wore rank insignia, and operated under strict protocol. Most were young, college-educated, and newly accustomed to command. Many would find themselves responsible for treating not fellow Americans, but captured Germans shipped in from overseas hospitals. Back home, civilians adjusted uneasily to the idea that enemy soldiers were living behind fences only miles away. Editorials questioned the fairness of giving them decent food, while ration coupons tightened American dinner tables. But military leadership held firm, treating prisoners well protected American captives in Europe, and it reinforced an image of moral superiority that Washington wanted the world to see when victory finally came. From the Pacific Northwest to the Gulf Coast, that policy took shape in wood, wire, and white hospital tents. Camps like Aliceville, Alabama, and Hearne, Texas, became models of humane efficiency. Beneath the flags and floodlights, the daily routines blurred the line between punishment and procedure. And it was within these routines, inside sterile wards smelling of carbolic and canvas, that the most striking encounters occurred. Encounters where the discipline of a nurse's salute could disarm an ideology built on contempt. When the war erupted across continents, American women answered a call few had ever imagined. By 1944, the Army Nurse Corps numbered over 59,000 officers, trained professionals who served everywhere from muddy field tents in Normandy to antiseptic wards in Kansas and Alabama. They wore khaki or olive drab uniforms, held commissions, and followed the same chain of command as male officers. Their mission, however, had no weapon: preserve life, regardless of uniform color. Training drilled both efficiency and composure. Instructors at Fort Des Moines or Camp Rucker repeated the Code of Geneva obligations until it became reflex. "You treat the wound, not the flag," one instructor famously told recruits. And so, when German casualties began arriving from Atlantic convoys and European evacuation hospitals, these nurses did precisely that. One of the first to face the test was the 168th Station Hospital in England in mid-1944. After D-Day, it received waves of wounded, British, American, and German. The medical staff was multinational, but the standard of care was singular. Nurses logged enemy patients with meticulous handwriting. Schmidt, Karl. Shrapnel, left thigh. Pulse, 84. There was no note of ideology, only anatomy. Reports from the period describe German officers lying in clean beds under the same sterile sheets as Allied soldiers, tended by American women who checked their temperatures, replaced bandages, and addressed them by rank. Back home, the system mirrored that order. The American Red Cross mobilized tens of thousands of volunteers known as Gray Ladies, named for their light gray uniforms. These were mostly older women, teachers, nurses, secretaries, who worked without pay in military hospitals. Their duties were quiet but profound: reading letters aloud to bedridden patients, writing replies, serving coffee, or simply listening. Many of their patients were German POWs, recovering in guarded hospital wings. Survivors later recalled the dissonance: captured officers, indoctrinated since adolescence with visions of American degeneracy, stunned to find middle-aged women addressing them politely, offering magazines and cigarettes, ensuring they could write home through Red Cross channels. It was, to them, a moral shock. At Camp Hearne, Texas, a sprawling facility north of Houston, German officers organized choirs, theater troupes, and even art classes. A POW newspaper, printed under American supervision, recorded medical updates and entertainment schedules. The camp hospital ran with military precision. Nurses maintained the same protocols for diet, bed rest, and medication as they would for any U.S. serviceman. Their presence carried authority, rank on their shoulders, confidence in their tone. In Aliceville, Alabama, the hospital stood at the center of the compound. Long white wards, screened windows, floors scrubbed daily. Wounded prisoners from North Africa arrived with malaria, ulcers, or desert injuries. They were deloused, washed, and treated. Some arrived defiant, refusing to speak English. Weeks later, they were writing thank you notes in careful script. But not every encounter was harmonious. Reports show that fraternization rules tightened as months passed. Friendly conversation could be mistaken for sympathy. A nurse caught accepting a handmade gift risked disciplinary action. Commanders feared the optics of kindness as much as its absence. Compassion had to be balanced against control. Despite that tension, the system endured because it was efficient. Morale among POWs remained high, escapes were few, and outbreaks of violence were rare. American officers credited this to consistent treatment, firm discipline without cruelty, care without condescension. The presence of professional women amplified that equilibrium. Their calm authority diffused resentment more effectively than barbed wire ever could. Even far from the front, their work carried the pulse of war. Letters from nurses described nights interrupted by ambulance convoys, days spent changing dressings in stifling heat, and evenings writing reports under dim bulbs. Yet few complained. They measured success not in medals, but in the steady beat of recovery. An enemy soldier stabilized, a fever broken, another name checked off the chart. By 1945, the pattern had become routine across hundreds of camps. Behind each statistic stood a human contradiction. German prisoners tended by American women, some of whom had brothers still fighting in Europe, others mourning those already lost. Compassion had become policy, and policy had become habit. That habit, of discipline, of duty, of restrained mercy, was the quiet strength beneath the American war machine, and it would soon reveal unexpected dimensions, ethical, cultural, even racial, as the human angles of this story deepened beyond rules and routines. The legal and ethical framework. At the heart of America's treatment of enemy prisoners was not sentimentality, but law. The 1929 Geneva Convention laid down precise standards. Prisoners must receive food, shelter, and medical care equal to that of the captor's own soldiers. The War Department circulated manuals detailing everything from calorie counts to infirmary cleanliness. These rules were drilled into officers and nurses alike. They were not acts of charity. They were orders. Yet the ethical weight ran deeper than obligation. To the Army Nurse Corps, the convention was more than paperwork. It was an oath. Each act of care reaffirmed a principle that even amid total war, civilization depended on restraint. When an American nurse addressed a German captain as "Sir," she wasn't honoring the man. She was honoring the code that separated her from him. That distinction mattered profoundly in a century defined by industrial slaughter. In practice, this legal scaffolding transformed hospital wards into small moral sanctuaries. Here, the wounded enemy lay under fluorescent light, stripped of insignia but not of dignity. Regulations dictated that POWs be treated without adverse distinction of race, nationality, religious belief, or political opinion. For many nurses, that clause became a daily meditation, a reminder that professionalism could itself be a quiet form of patriotism. And for the German officers who expected vengeance, that professionalism struck with unexpected force. The medical and operational discipline war medicine was the most unforgiving branch of logistics. Supplies, triage, sanitation, all had to flow like machinery. When German prisoners arrived by truck or hospital train, they were integrated into that machinery seamlessly. The Army Medical Department oversaw a system that mirrored combat zones: registration, isolation, surgery, recovery. Nurses became the linchpins between paperwork and flesh. At facilities like Camp Shanks, New York, and Aliceville, Alabama, routine replaced ideology. Wounds were assessed by severity, not allegiance. A fractured femur demanded traction. A fever demanded quinine. Nurses rotated between Allied and Axis wards with the same precision. Gauze changed every 4 hours. Medication logged to the minute. The neutrality of procedure created an equilibrium even the guards respected. Mortality rates told the story. Among German POWs treated in U.S. hospitals, deaths from injury or illness were astonishingly low, less than 1%. It was not luck, it was system. Each successful recovery reinforced an image of America that propaganda could never build, a nation both powerful and principled. Behind the efficiency, though, lay quiet exhaustion. Many nurses worked 18-hour shifts under strict discipline. They saluted every officer, logged every syringe, and faced the paradox of nurturing men who had once advanced under a flag that sought their subjugation. To remain emotionally neutral required immense inner control, a discipline equal to any soldiers on the front. The home front labor connection. Beyond the hospital fences stretched a different battlefield, the economic front. By 1944, America's agricultural workforce was depleted by conscription. German prisoners filled that void. Under strict supervision, they harvested cotton in Texas, cut timber in Oregon, and picked fruit in California. They were paid token wages, used to buy toiletries or stationery from camp canteens. For local civilians, the sight was surreal. Columns of enemy soldiers bent over American fields under the sun. Yet the arrangement was pragmatic. Farmers needed labor. The military needed discipline, maintained through purpose. Work reduced idleness, curbed escape attempts, and, according to commanders, restored morale. Occasionally, German prisoners interacted with civilians, often through necessity, sometimes through curiosity. Many were surprised by their treatment outside the wire, respectful, businesslike, even cordial. The women who supervised kitchen details or laundry crews often enforced rules with quiet authority rather than aggression. Over time, these encounters eroded stereotypes on both sides. Newspapers occasionally printed reports of farmers sending Christmas parcels to their German laborers or of towns holding concerts attended by POW choirs. The War Department tolerated such gestures cautiously, fearing public backlash, but they reflected something deeper, a society confident enough to temper victory with humanity. Each field, each ward, each routine exchange between guard, nurse, and prisoner became part of a larger national performance, one that projected order, justice, and mercy all at once. And yet, beneath that calm surface, new tensions were forming, racial, cultural, and moral questions that the Geneva Convention could not fully answer. For as the war pressed on, compassion itself began to reveal its own hierarchies. The racial paradox. Few contradictions of the Second World War were as stark as this one. Black American nurses, serving in segregated units, were ordered to care for captured Nazi soldiers who had once championed racial purity. By late 1944, manpower shortages compelled the U.S. Army to assign African American nurses to prisoner-of-war hospitals across the South and Southwest. At Camp Florence, Arizona, and Papago Park near Phoenix, officers like Lieutenant Eleanor Powell found themselves face-to-face with men who bore swastika tattoos. The Army itself refused to allow black nurses to treat white American soldiers, but permitted them to treat white German POWs. To the women who accepted those orders, professionalism became both shield and protest. They followed every protocol, sterilizing instruments, recording dosages, maintaining composure. In interviews decades later, nurses described the uneasy tension. They were upholding American ideals denied to them by their own nation. Some German patients, raised on propaganda of Aryan superiority, were astonished. They saluted the nurses out of habit, confused by a hierarchy their ideology could not explain. The paradox was painful but transformative. It forced both nurse and prisoner to confront the gap between doctrine and humanity. In that sterile hospital light, superiority dissolved. There was only competence, calm, and control, qualities that quietly undermined every notion of racial supremacy. The cultural and human exchange. Inside the wire, life followed patterns that slowly humanized the enemy. Camps developed their own cultures, orchestras, sports leagues, and classrooms flourished. German POWs painted murals, crafted wooden toys, and wrote newsletters, some allowed to circulate under censorship. The Gray Ladies played a vital part in these interactions. They distributed books, helped translate letters, and organized small events on holidays. A POW might find a note in his meal tray reading "Merry Christmas" in English, penned by a volunteer he would never meet. To the prisoners, these gestures felt disorienting, kindness from those they had been taught to despise. In Alabama, a nurse recalled a choir performance in which German prisoners sang "Stille Nacht" on Christmas Eve. The audience, American guards and nurses, stood in silence. For a few minutes, the sound of harmony replaced the hum of generators and the barking of orders. It was not forgiveness. It was recognition. Humanity could survive the machine of war, if only briefly. Many POWs later testified to this effect in letters after repatriation. Some described America as the place where they first learned democracy. Others returned to Germany determined to rebuild under different principles. Compassion, delivered through routine gestures of medical care or simple civility, had become an unintentional weapon of influence. The security and control dimension compassion alone could not sustain a POW system. Discipline did. The U.S. Army balanced mercy with order through precise structure. Every camp had watchtowers, barbed wire, armed patrols, and strict curfews. Escape attempts were rare, barely 2,000 among hundreds of thousands of prisoners. This efficiency was by design. The War Department learned quickly that humane treatment reduced defiance. Prisoners with clean beds and predictable routines rarely rebelled. Medical wards, though governed by empathy, operated under military rigidity. Visiting hours fixed, supplies counted, guards stationed at each door. The women who worked within this system carried dual authority. Their gentleness did not erase command. It enforced it. A nurse's clipboard and calm voice often achieved what a rifle could not: compliance. Soldiers understood rank, and these women wore it. When a German lieutenant balked at taking orders from a woman, she could remind him quietly that within these fences she outranked him by law. Such control was the quiet genius of the American approach. It proved that discipline could coexist with decency. The line between compassion and authority was razor thin, but those who walked it did so with unflinching steadiness. By early 1945, that equilibrium, law, medicine, morality, control, had crystallized into a model envied even by Britain. Yet as Europe collapsed and new waves of prisoners arrived, the system would face its most revealing test. The war was ending, but its moral challenges were only beginning. By the summer of 1944, victory in Europe seemed visible on the horizon, but it brought with it a new crisis of logistics. German POWs were arriving in such numbers that the American system, so proud of its order, began to strain. Thousands more wounded were pouring into camp hospitals every week, and the military's greatest shortage was not beds or medicine. It was nurses. To fill the gap, the War Department turned to a resource it had long analyzed: Black Army nurses. The policy shift came quietly, buried in administrative memos that cited personnel necessity. but what it produced on the ground was unprecedented. At Camp Florence, Arizona, rows of white barracks shimmered under the desert heat. Inside one ward, a new team of nurses arrived in pressed olive uniforms, each with gold lieutenant bars pinned to her collar. Among them was Lieutenant Eleanor Powell, 24 years old, daughter of a Massachusetts minister, one of the first black women ever commissioned in the Army Nurse Corps. She had trained at the Tuskegee Veterans Hospital, an institution already forced to operate under segregation. Now she found herself assigned to a German prisoner of war hospital, staffed entirely by white male doctors and guarded by white military police. Her first shift began at dawn. POW orderlies rolled stretchers bearing wounded German soldiers, men captured in North Africa and Sicily, some still wearing swastika rings. One glared when he saw her. Another muttered something under his breath that she couldn't understand, but didn't need to. Powell kept her expression neutral, her movements exact. She took his pulse, changed his dressing, recorded the numbers, and moved on. That routine, repeated countless times across America, was a quiet revolution. Here was a black American woman, treated as second class by her own country, practicing impartial care on men who believed her race subhuman. The irony was almost biblical. And yet in that irony lay a strange kind of redemption, not for ideology, but for principle. Army reports from the period note that Negro nurses performed their duties with exemplary discipline. What they do not capture is the emotional weight behind those words, the awareness that professionalism had become defiance. For every bandage wrapped and every wound cleaned, these nurses were proving a truth that Nazi racial science could never compute, that authority and compassion were not the property of any color. At Papago Park, just outside Phoenix, similar scenes unfolded. The camp had become famous for its massive 1944 escape attempt, 25 German officers tunneling beneath the desert floor only to be recaptured within weeks. But inside its hospital, a quieter drama was taking place. Black nurses tended to prisoners who saluted them out of confusion, not respect. Some refused treatment at first, others, over time, softened. One prisoner, a former Luftwaffe mechanic, later wrote that he could not reconcile his ideology with what he witnessed. "They treated me as if I were human," he confessed in a post-war letter. The turning point of this story is not a battle or a treaty. It is a psychological one. Compassion, disciplined and professional, dismantled the logic of hate more effectively than any interrogation. Every neutral act, the steady hand adjusting a bandage, the calm tone giving medication, became a small act of resistance against both fascism abroad and prejudice at home. These women were soldiers of a different kind. They carried no rifles, yet every day they challenged two empires, one that preached Aryan supremacy and one that still enforced segregation through law. Even the War Department's own inspection officers began to take notice. Reports from the Medical Corps described improved patient morale and reduced disciplinary incidents in POW wards staffed by black nurses. The same documents, in careful bureaucratic prose, warned of potential public sensitivity to such assignments in southern states. Proof that the American conscience was as divided as its enemies had been. And yet, through it all, the nurses continued their work. Quiet, steady, relentless. They saluted their superiors, treated their patients, and kept the records immaculate. They did not protest because their professionalism was protest. In the great machinery of World War II, they were small gears, but ones that turned history toward something cleaner, steadier, more just. And as 1944 turned to 1945, that moral momentum reached its height. Across the Atlantic, the German front collapsed. In America, camp hospitals braced for the final surge. thousands of wounded prisoners transferred from Europe before the war's end. It was in those final months that compassion would face its harshest test yet. By December 1944, the war in Europe was entering its final, blood-soaked phase. The Battle of the Bulge had begun, and with it came a flood of casualties, Allied and Axis alike. In England and across the eastern United States, hospital ships unloaded waves of wounded German prisoners from makeshift triage centers in Belgium and France. For many, the war was over the moment they were lifted onto a stretcher, but their bodies still carried its ruin. At the 168th Station Hospital in Cheltenham, England, the wards overflowed. Nurses moved through rows of cots under dim blackout lights. Shell-shocked young Germans stared at the ceiling, lips moving soundlessly. Some still wore frozen mud on their boots. The nurses had no time for ideology. Infection and hemorrhage waited for no one. Their routines, blood pressure, pulse, dressings, became a kind of meditation amid chaos. Across the ocean, in stateside camps like Aliceville, Herne, and Camp McCain, the atmosphere was taut with transition. Everyone knew the war was nearing its end. The guards, the administrators, even the prisoners sensed it. Yet the machinery of care kept turning. Trucks arrived daily from ports with new casualties, men burned, frostbitten, or emaciated from field capture. Inside those hospitals, discipline held firm. The nurses, many only in their 20s, had learned to suppress emotion. Compassion was not a choice. It was procedure. They spoke little, their voices even, their movements deliberate. When a German officer refused food in protest of defeat, an American nurse logged it clinically, checked his pulse, and left water by his bed. Hours later, hunger overrode pride. He drank. In those sterile spaces, the moral theater of the war reached its most poignant scene. The prisoners had once marched under banners promising a 1,000-year Reich. Now they lay weak and shivering, tended by women from the nation that had destroyed it. Yet what humbled them was not defeat, it was dignity. The nurses did not mock or gloat. They recorded temperatures, issued painkillers, replaced bandages, and moved on to the next patient. One nurse later wrote in her diary, "They come in broken and expect hatred. We give them gauze and silence. Sometimes that silence speaks louder than victory." At Papago Park, the same paradox unfolded. The escaped officers who had tunneled into the desert earlier that year were now back in custody, many suffering dehydration and exposure. When they were brought into the infirmary, they braced for punishment. Instead, they were met by the same black nurses they had ignored months earlier, Lieutenants Eleanor Powell and Aileen Coleman, checking vitals, replacing IVs, and recording data as if nothing had changed. The prisoners' confusion was palpable. One attempted a clumsy apology in English. Powell acknowledged it with a nod and continued her work. Outside the camps, public sentiment grew restless. Newspapers questioned why enemy soldiers were still being fed, while American families rationed sugar and meat. Congress received letters demanding harsher measures. But within the camps, the opposite was true. The system had never been more humane. The War Department understood the stakes. As Allied troops liberated concentration camps across Europe, the contrast between Nazi brutality and American order became central to post-war messaging. The way America treated its prisoners had become a form of diplomacy, a prelude to peace. The nurses, without knowing it, were now performing on history's stage. Every dressing they changed, every word they withheld, contributed to a portrait of discipline that the U.S. government would later highlight in films, newsreels, and policy briefings. The Geneva Convention's clauses were no longer abstract ideals. They were proof that democracy could wage total war without losing its soul. In April 1945, as Germany collapsed, the flow of prisoners slowed. Victory was near, but the nurses didn't celebrate. They still had wards full of men who coughed through the night, whose bodies reeked of gangrene and despair. When Germany finally surrendered on May 8, 1945, the camps didn't erupt in joy. Instead, there was an eerie quiet. POWs stood for roll call as usual, then returned to their chores. Many cried in private, others simply stared through the fences at a horizon they might never cross again. That night, in one hospital tent, Lieutenant Ramsey, one of the first nurses assigned to Aliceville, finished her shift and walked past the rows of sleeping prisoners. A German captain stirred and whispered in halting English, "You have no hate." She paused, adjusted his blanket, and replied softly, "No, just orders?" But she knew, and he did too, that those orders were what separated one world from another. The war had ended, but in that quiet ward, the real victory had already been won. When the guns finally fell silent in Europe, America faced the immense task of unwinding its wartime machinery. Among the last gears to slow were the prisoner of war camps. Across the nation, floodlights dimmed, watchtowers emptied, and the once constant rhythm of roll calls faded into routine paperwork. The war was over, but the prisoners remained. In total, the United States held more than 425,000 Axis captives, including over 370,000 Germans, in more than 600 camps, scattered from the deserts of Arizona to the forests of Wisconsin. The government now had to repatriate them, a process that would take nearly 2 years. Ships bound for Europe carried them home in waves between 1945 and 1946. Yet for many, home was now rubble. Bombed-out cities, divided borders, and uncertain futures awaited them. Reports from the War Department's Provost Marshal General's office describe the procedure in careful detail. Medical exams, inoculations, psychological screening, and final pay adjustments before departure. Nurses oversaw the medical clearance lines, ensuring every man was fit to travel. They worked silently, efficiently, as the prisoners filed past, men they had tended for months, sometimes years. For many German officers, those moments of farewell were unexpectedly emotional. Letters later collected by camp administrators contain words of gratitude that seemed impossible just years earlier. A major from Bremen wrote, "In your hospitals we found not vengeance, but fairness. We go home defeated, but not dishonored." Another prisoner thanked the nurses for teaching us that respect is stronger than force. Camps like Aliceville became temporary way stations of reconciliation. When repatriation began in earnest in 1946, the departing prisoners left behind neatly folded uniforms, sketches, poems, and handcrafted gifts, wooden boxes, painted portraits, small tokens carved from scrap lumber. The nurses were instructed not to keep such mementos officially, but many did, tucked away in drawers as quiet relics of a strange peace. Statistically, the experiment had been a success. Out of nearly 500,000 POWs, fewer than 3,000 escape attempts were recorded, and only a handful turned violent. Disease rates were low, morale remarkably stable. Inspectors from neutral Switzerland praised American compliance with Geneva standards, calling it exemplary in both humanity and efficiency. Yet beneath those clean reports lay deeper transformations. Many former prisoners carried their experiences into post-war Germany's reconstruction. Some applied to emigrate back to the United States, citing their treatment as the reason. Decades later, small delegations of ex-POWs returned to visit the towns where they had once been confined. They were welcomed, not as enemies, but as guests. For the nurses, the transition to peacetime was more complex. Demobilization came quickly. Uniforms were folded away, commissions dissolved. Some returned to civilian hospitals, others married, started families, or joined the Veterans Administration. A few wrote memoirs, though most never spoke publicly of their work. Theirs had been a quiet service, uncelebrated yet indispensable. Among black nurses, the return was bittersweet. Having upheld the highest ideals of military conduct, they returned to a society still segregated. Yet their presence in POW hospitals had planted a seed of change. Their professionalism had been witnessed by white officers, documented in official records, and quietly discussed in policy circles. Within 3 years, President Harry S. Truman would sign Executive Order 9981, desegregating the U.S. Armed Forces, a decision shaped in part by wartime evidence that competence had no color. As one historian later wrote, they served the enemy and in doing so conquered prejudice. The war's end had revealed that compassion could be a form of power, a strategic, stabilizing force, as vital as any weapon. But the legacy of that power would continue to evolve, reshaping the moral landscape of a nation that had learned to fight hate, not only with arms, but with discipline and grace. And that legacy deepened even further in the post-war years, as the principles born in those POW wards began to echo through military policy, medical ethics, and the global conscience of warfare itself. When the last prisoner ships left American harbors in 1946, the story of the German POWs seemed finished, yet its moral echoes only grew louder in the years that followed. What had begun as logistical necessity became one of the quiet cornerstones of post-war ethics, a living demonstration that even in the most violent century, law and mercy could coexist. The United States used that record deliberately. In press briefings and post-war propaganda, the War Department contrasted the humane conditions of its POW camps with the horrors uncovered in Europe. Film reels distributed by the Office of War Information showed German prisoners playing soccer, receiving mail, or being treated in spotless hospital wards. Behind those images were real people, nurses, volunteers, and administrators who had refused to compromise the standards written in Geneva 17 years earlier. In 1949, the revised Geneva Conventions expanded those standards, adding clearer clauses for the protection and medical care of prisoners. The reforms drew heavily from reports written by Allied nations, particularly American medical officers and Red Cross observers. Their documentation of the 1942-46 POW system became model policy, cited in post-war tribunals and military law courses. The signature of those nurses, their records, charts, and testimonies, was etched quietly into the foundation of international humanitarian law. For the women who had lived it, the recognition was subdued but meaningful. The Army Nurse Corps, once dismissed as auxiliary, became a permanent branch of the U.S. Army in 1947. Training academies integrated their wartime lessons into doctrine, strict neutrality, procedural compassion, and emotional discipline. Red Cross volunteers continued their service in the Korean War and beyond. Many of them veterans of POW wards who carried forward the same ethos: firmness without cruelty, care without bias. Among African American nurses, the legacy was even more profound. Their assignments to German POW hospitals, though born of discrimination, had exposed the hypocrisy of segregation under the world's gaze. White officers who had doubted their ability were forced to acknowledge their excellence under pressure. Historians now regard that contradiction as a moral pivot in U.S. military history, proof that equality was not an ideal to be granted, but a fact already demonstrated. In the decades that followed, those same women became mentors in civilian medicine, teaching new generations of nurses the same discipline that had steadied them through war. When they spoke of their experiences, they rarely invoked politics or ideology. Instead, they described the rhythm of care, the hiss of a sterilizer, the weight of a clipboard, the quiet moment before dawn when the ward finally stilled. They spoke of men who had saluted them, confused and humbled, and of the strange peace that followed. Many of those men wrote back years later. Letters from Germany arrived addressed simply to the nurses of Camp Florence or the hospital at Aliceville. Some contained photographs, families rebuilt, children born, lives reclaimed. The tone was always the same, gratitude tinged with disbelief. They had entered captivity expecting humiliation and left with a new understanding of what strength could look like. By the 1950s, the physical traces of those camps had vanished. Barracks were torn down, fences dismantled, fields replanted. But the memory endured in local museums, veterans' archives, and oral histories recorded by nurses in their later years. One former Red Cross volunteer summarized it best. "We fought by saving lives. Sometimes that is the hardest kind of war." The humane treatment of German prisoners did not erase the atrocities of the conflict, but it did provide a counterpoint, a proof that moral restraint could survive total war. It became a benchmark for future generations of soldiers, medics, and policymakers. In the end, it was not the size of the camps or the number of prisoners that defined this chapter of history. It was the quiet authority of those who refused to let hatred dictate their duty. And through their discipline, they left behind something rarer than victory: credibility. A belief that compassion, if protected by order, can outlast even the darkest of wars. History often remembers wars through explosions, conquests, and ruins. Yet sometimes the truest victories happen in silence, in the measured rhythm of a nurse's footsteps echoing through a dim corridor, in the steady hand that tends to an enemy's wound, in the refusal to let hatred define a generation. The German officers who arrived in America expecting vengeance found something far more disarming: procedure, not mercy born of softness, but compassion rooted in discipline. The American women who treated them, Army nurses, Red Cross volunteers, and the often forgotten black nurses of segregated units, did not heal them out of affection. They did it because the rules demanded decency, and because professionalism was their form of strength. That choice, to follow law, not fury, reverberated far beyond the wards of Aliceville or Camp Florence. It shaped how the world would measure civilization after the war. The Geneva Conventions were not rewritten in ivory towers. They were refined in the quiet acts of those who refused to abandon humanity, even when surrounded by its collapse. In those sterile hospital rooms where prisoners once saluted their captors with confusion and awe, the moral balance of the 20th century shifted by degrees. Compassion, stripped of sentimentality and bound by order, became a weapon more enduring than any bomb or gun. For the nurses who returned home, there were no parades, no medals. Their triumph was quieter, the knowledge that they had preserved the very principle the war was fought to defend, that human dignity is indivisible, even in defeat. And for the men who left those camps, scarred but alive, the lesson lingered. Many carried it back across the ocean, into the rebuilding of a nation once consumed by hatred. In the end, what shocked them most was not American power, it was American restraint.